Om Prithvi Shantirantariksha Shantir Dyav Shantir Disha Shantiravantara Disha Shantiragni Shantir Vayu Shantiraditya Shantish Chandrama Shantir Nakshatrani Shantirapa Shantiroshadaya Shantir Vanaspataya Shantir Gau Shantiraja Shantirashva Shantir Purusha Shantir Brahma Shantir Brahmana Shantir Shantireva Shanti Shantirame Astu Shantihi. May there be peace on earth and in the sky. May there be peace in the water and in all directions. May there be peace in the plants, in the trees, and in animals. May there be peace in the hearts of all beings. May there be peace in everyone and in everything. Sarvetra sukhinas santu, sarve santu niramayaha, sarve bhadrani pashyantu, ma kaschit dukha bhag bhavet, sarvastaratu durgani, sarvo bhadrani pashyatu, sarvas sadbuddhimapnotu, sarvas sarvatra nandatu. May all be happy and healthy. May all see what is good, and may no one experience misery. May all overcome their obstacles and acquire good tendencies. May people everywhere find joy and fulfillment. Let us now spend some time touching the center of peace and joy in our hearts. A good way to begin the practice is to withdraw the scattered energies of the mind and bring them to rest on one point. That point can be our own breathing. Let us therefore practice breathing with awareness. As we breathe in, let us visualize that our body and mind are being filled with love, strength, and compassion. And as we breathe out, let us release all the stress, anxiety, and exhaustion in the body and mind. Let us practice this way for a while. Let us now turn our attention to the region of our heart. Although God is present everywhere and in everyone, the divine presence can be felt most clearly in our own hearts. We can meditate in any way we have been taught. To remain focused, we can take the help of a short mental prayer or a mantra or a divine name. Let us now spend some time dwelling on the presence of God in our hearts. Om Asatoma Satgamaya Tamasoma Jyotirgamaya Mrityorma Amritam Gamaya Aviravir Maheti Rudrayatte Dakshinam Mukham Te Namam Pahi Nityam. May the Divine lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May the Divine Consciousness fill our hearts and protect us. We begin today on verse number 298. There are satyanye pratibandha pumsa samsara hetavo drishtaha teshamevam moolam prathama vikaro bhavatyahankaraha. There are other obstacles that lead to a person's being in samsara. At their root is egoism, which is the first modification of ignorance. The earlier verse described identifications, the different identifications that we have as a primary obstacle in our understanding our true nature. Now this verse points out the other obstacles, and these include the negativities or things that bind us, that weigh us down, such as attachment, anger, delusion, envy, jealousy, and everything that keeps us tied to samsara. And we have seen the word samsara occurs again and again in these texts. In literally translated, it means that which is constantly moving, constantly changing. And if we look at our experience in life, both what is going on inside us and what is happening outside us, we will see that if anything is constant in the world, it is change. The world outside is changing in many different ways, and that's pretty obvious. And as we get older, we are able to perceive that change even more. Sometimes you might hear our parents, our grandparents saying, "Oh, in our childhood, things were very different." And we will say that to those who come after us. But changes are occurring inside us as well. So all of these changes taken together is the nature of our present existence as human beings. And that is, all that idea is embodied in this word samsara. At their root is egoism. By that is meant that all obstacles, all problems, really everything in life is connected with I. As I've often pointed out, religious discussions often tend to begin with God, the source of everything and the nature of God, and that's one way to do it. Another way to approach the same inquiry is to start with the self, because even when we think about God, even when we think about the world, it's always with reference to the self. It's me trying to figure out what this is all about. It's me trying to figure out what the source of all creation is. And so Vedanta, specifically this text that we are studying, doesn't begin the exploration by inquiring who God is or what the source of the world is. It begins by asking, who is this person who is asking these questions? One other important point to keep in mind is that all of our inquiries, all of our problems, everything really is connected with I, because when this I disappears, as it does every night when we go to sleep, when we are not even dreaming, in that state sometimes described as deep sleep, in Sanskrit they call it sushupti, that time our I, however briefly, however temporarily, completely disappears. And when that I disappears, all of our inquiries, all of our explorations, all of our worries, all of our stress, everything disappears. This world as we know it disappears. And as soon as we wake up in the morning, or as soon as the dream starts, suddenly all this diversity immediately emerges. And so we see how the self is at the root of all this. As long as the self is there, self as the perceiver is there, then there will be the perception and there will be the things that are perceived. And therefore, at their root is egoism. The word in Sanskrit for egoism is ahankara. Aham is I. Ahankara really could also be translated as that which manufactures the sense of I. It is sometimes said that as soon as a baby is born, and I don't know the exact, the latest research on this, but they say that for the first few days or weeks, perhaps, the baby has no sense of I. A newborn baby does not really know where its body ends and the rest of the world begins. Sometimes, in fact, they do, is an anecdotal story about one professor of psychology when at his home, when his baby first uttered the pronoun I, he gave a big party. Psychologically speaking, the sense of I, that I am someone, I am a person, is a pretty big breakthrough in our life. Now, at that time, when we are just a few weeks old, of course, we are not in any way to express how we feel when that sense of I comes. But now, as grown-ups, we can at least speculate, we can imagine, and it would seem as if while the sense of I could be a thrilling experience, to know that I am an individual, I am someone, but the sense of I invariably comes alongside the sense of not I. Because if this is who I am, if this is me, then this is not me, this is not me, this is not me. So I and not I go together. And then when we grow up a little bit, even though we may or may not think about it consciously, at some level we discover that that which is not I is much bigger. I mean, the rest of the universe really, other than this, is not me. And that which is not me is so much bigger, so much more powerful. And then the root of our vulnerabilities, the root of our stress, our anxiety, our mortality become more and more clear when the sense of I and then this whole thing which is not I begin. So so the I plays a big role in our lives. Just think about from the moment we get up till the time we go to sleep, how often we use the pronoun I. Oh, I've got to do this. It's me, it's my problem, my this, and so on. It's somewhat ironic that we see the advance of knowledge as like knowing more and more about the world. We know things about the distant galaxies. We have split open an atom and are trying to see what's happened at this micro level. And that's great. But at the root of all knowledge, internal or external, is this I. And how much do we know about this I? What is this I? From where does this I come? And that's been the focus of this study. So it says here, which is the first modification of ignorance. And I think this is something worth reminding ourselves about, of how I can be a first modification of ignorance. And for that we need a quick reminder of the metaphysic that Vedanta presents. According to the framework that we are looking at, it is that the reality is one and undivided. And if it is one and undivided and infinite, then there is really no sense of I there. Because then there is an I-thou relationship. I and not I, they always go together. There is always this polarity. So if the reality is one undivided whole, then there is no I, you, there is no we, nothing. There is just this reality, which nothing much can be said about it. Now, if that, okay, before we go there, now, for instance, now, we might say, well, I know who I am, right? Most of us say, well, I know who I am. Now, are there times when we forget who we are? And we can say, yes, of course. Every night when we go to sleep, as long as we are asleep, we forget who we are. Because that's essentially how sleep occurs. After a nice heavy dinner, we go and lie down in our bed, switch off the light, turn and twist for a while. And until that time, we know who I am. I know I'm lying in my bed. I know also I'm trying to get sleep. But at some point, and none of us exactly knows the exact moment we fall asleep, suddenly sleep overtakes us. It's like a veil of darkness comes over us. Once sleep comes, we no longer know that we are still lying in our bed. We no longer know who we are. In fact, we might then acquire a completely different identity, because when the dream starts, maybe you may be lying down in your bed in Boston, and you might find yourself in Hawaii in your dream. So, and maybe you may not be exactly, your self-identity in dream may not be identical with your self-identity while awaking. So, this is our common experience now. So we know it's possible for us to forget who we are, and for a while at least, as long as we are dreaming, think of ourselves as somebody different and often in some different place. Now think about this one infinite reality. If that infinite reality were to kind of fall asleep, if that reality to forget, as we all do, and start dreaming, so what would be the forgetfulness of an infinite being be? That infinite being will forget I'm infinite and begin to see itself as finite. Will forget that it's free and begin to see itself as bound. Will forget that it is immortal and begin to see itself as mortal. So that's the idea here, that our present identity as mortal, imperfect, vulnerable human beings is an identity that has occurred as a result of self-forgetfulness. And sleep, in one sense, can be viewed as a stage of ignorance, because in sleep, I've forgotten what my waking identity is. I've forgotten everything in sleep. And if it's a deep sleep, I've just forgotten it. If it's a dream, then I have projected another identity on my real identity. And therefore, sleep, the state of darkness, is equated with ignorance. And this infinite reality, which is beyond the sense of I and not I, when it forgets itself, the sense of I is generated. Because once I become limited, once I become small, then I'm able to have this me and not me idea. And that's what is meant by saying egoism, or the sense of I, is at the first modification of ignorance. And ignorance is meant forgetfulness of my true nature. One other way to consider this is also that ultimate reality is beyond what are in Sanskrit sometimes called the three factors: desha, kala, nimitta, space, time, and causality. So once I fall into the domain of time, then I become mortal, because then I have birth and I have death. Once I fall into the domain of space, I become a limited entity. And so that's how time and space bring us into this ever-changing, constantly changing thing that we call the world. Verse 299. Yavat syat swasya sambandho ahankarena duratmana tavanna leshamatrapi mukti varta vilakshana. Even the least talk about spiritual liberation, which is unique, is impossible as long as a person is filled with this wretched egoism. And that kind of makes sense. As long as I am filled with the idea that I'm a mortal human being, I cannot simultaneously recognize my true identity as an immortal divine being, because the two are polar opposites. Just as light and darkness cannot be together, exactly in the same way, as long as I see myself as mortal, immortality would just seem as some kind of a distant, almost unachievable dream. As long as I see I'm imperfect, then I would strive to be perfect. But still, I cannot be imperfect and perfect at the same time. And that is why, if I have to be spiritually free, freedom, in one sense, one way of understanding freedom is total independence. We are not dependent on anything outside of ourselves. And then we realize, if this way of understanding freedom, all our talk of freedom is quite superficial, is quite limited. I mean, we do make distinction about we live in a free society compared to many other parts of the world where they don't enjoy the kind of freedoms we do. And that's true. At one level, it's true that in many ways, we are more free than some other people in some other parts of the world. But can we truly say that we are completely independent? And none of us can truly say that. As human beings, we are dependent on so many factors. We're dependent on nature for air, water, food. We are dependent on the support of our family, our friends. We are dependent on our country to protect us in times of danger. There's just no end. I mean, life would be impossible. Sometimes when people say, I'm a self-made person, no one is self-made. We have to acknowledge with gratitude that right from the time we were born, we have received so much from the world outside, from people around us, from so many different ways, that whatever we are now at this point, we're the resultant of everything that has come to us. And therefore, we are not really free in that sense. And coming back to the idea of self, my idea of self now is this being with this body and mind. And we know we are not really free at the physical level. No matter how much organic food you eat, no matter how often you go to the gym, none of us can say that we have never fallen ill or we will never fall ill. Yes, we can have a reasonably good health, but the body will break down now and then. And then eventually it will break down fully, and that's what death is. Again, no one is exempt from death. No one is exempt from any kind of illness. Illness will come sometime or the other. No one is exempt from the process of aging. And we know, those of us, well, not most of you are young here, but as we get older, We recognize that the body no longer has the kind of vitality it had when it was young. The body has its own problems. And so the limitations that are imposed upon us just by dwelling inside this body, we are aware of. And of course, as I said, that the three, the illness, aging, and death, something that the three first sights that the Buddha observed in his transformation or is an exploration of the truth. But there is also limitation of the mind. No matter how much eager I am to study, to know, you go inside a library and you see these hundreds and thousands of volumes, and you know, realistically, you're never going to be able to read all of them. In fact, someone said, every time I go to the library and look at all these volumes, and I feel so relieved that I'm just fine without having read any of them. But even if we want to read them, we know time is limited, energy is limited. We also know that the brain can get exhausted after a while. You can just have a book in front of you, but after a while, you said, I can't take it anymore. I just need to rest for a while. So the mind has its limitations, the body has its limitations, and we are operating all throughout our lives within this limited, frail, imperfect body and mind. Are we really free? We are not. And therefore it says, the spiritual liberation that is spoken of here is freedom in the truest sense of the term. Not simply, I mean, it's great, political freedom, economic freedom and all of that, that's wonderful. But freedom in the fullest sense. Think about, I mean, we always complain about stress and anxiety and worry. That's not a sign of freedom. There are all these external factors holding me down. So spiritual liberation, the word moksha or mukti as it is talked about in these books, really means freedom in the fullest sense. That is nothing binding me, that I'm not dependent. It's like this. Even if I'm dependent on even one thing or one person outside me, I can never be free. Because anything that is outside me can be potentially taken away from me. The only entity that can never be taken away from me is me. That's it. Nobody can take me away from me. But other than that, well, in other words, also it means whatever can be taken away from me, whatever can be separated from me is not me. So these clothes, the clothes can go away, they are not me. If we see death as separation from the body, then that's not me. Otherwise, then I'm not myself fully. And of course, Hindus and many Eastern traditions do accept the possibility of rebirth and reincarnation. So they don't see the body as the most essential, inseparable part of my being. So as long as we are filled with this, the word used is wretched egoism, something that holds me down, weighs me down, I cannot be free. So therefore, the root of all problem being egoism, we have to find a way how we can transcend it, how we can get over it. Verse 300. Ahankara grahan muktaha swarupamupapadyate chandravat vimalav purnaha sadananda swayam prabha. Freed like the moon from the clutches of egoism, the person attains the true self, who is pure, infinite, ever blissful, and self-effulgent. Freed like the moon is really a reference to the eclipses. In Indian mythology, sometimes they described an eclipse as a demon called Rahu. So essentially what happens is when we see, if there is a lunar eclipse, full moon, and then the moon gets covered either partially or fully. And in ancient times, they personified the whole phenomenon, think that there was a certain demon who went and kind of swallowed a part of the moon or wholly the moon. And when the eclipse ended, they said finally that moon has been released from the clutches of that demon. And so that's the reference here, freed like the moon from the clutches of egoism. So just like that demon in mythology seems to swallow the moon, and that's how darkness spreads, ignorance has swallowed my true nature, and that's how now I have become this troubled human being wandering about in this samsara. So only when we are freed from that do we attain our true self. And the nature of the true self is it's pure, infinite, ever blissful, and self-effulgent. The ego is what diminishes us. Many religious traditions, in one way or the other, through mythology or through many different ways, you'll find this kind of a common pattern that at some point, at some way, there was this ideal state. And of course, the present state is not seen as the ideal state. So somehow there has been a fall from that ideal state now to our present state. And then somehow we need to go back to that ideal state. And that idea of fall can be through, for example, the story of Adam and Eve from the garden, the Eden, when they fell and they disobeyed the Lord. And then, of course, the original sin and the way theology gets developed. And that's how now we have to now find a way to go back to the divine source from which we came. So that's one way of looking at fall. In this text, the fall is described from that my true nature as this blissful, infinite, perfect, pure being. Now I have fallen into my present state of a mortal, finite, imperfect human being. That's the idea. Verse 301. Yo va puraisho ahamiti pratito buddhya prakluptas tamasati mudhaya tasyeva nisheshataya vinashe brahmatma bhava pratibandha shunyaha. One's identity with Brahman becomes free from obstacles only when there is the total destruction of that which is created by the foolish intellect steeped in ignorance and which is experienced in this body as this is me. Foolish intellect steeped in ignorance is, we go back to the classical example we often give to highlight this idea, a rope mistaken for a snake. Nobody in their right mind would mistake a rope for a snake. But of course, in a bright light, you'll be able to see the rope as a rope. In complete darkness, you won't see the rope at all. But if there is just enough light for you to know that there is an object in front of you, but not enough light to know what that object is, then it's possible to mistake a coiled rope in a room to be a coiled snake. Essentially, we are superimposing a snake on the reality of the rope. And there we see a snake where the rope is because there is not sufficient light. And so ignorance, oftentimes in religious language, oftentimes ignorance is compared to darkness and knowledge to light. And therefore, it's because of that darkness of ignorance here that I'm not seeing the reality of who I truly am. And just as foolishly a person might mistake a rope for a snake, I am foolishly mistaking this infinite, true, pure and perfect being into a mortal, vulnerable, imperfect human being. That's the analogy here. Sometimes I did refer to this before, so this idea of me, the word I, and the word I oftentimes we used in a rather confusing sort of way, but we just so effortlessly and foolishly, I might say, go from I and mine. For instance, what is my relationship with the body? Sometimes I would refer to the body as just me. Now I can say, I am sitting here. But essentially what is sitting here is, well, is this body, right? So I'm referring to the body as I am sitting here. But on the other hand, if my hand starts hurting and I say, my hand is hurt. So how come that which is I suddenly has now become mine? And we know that the two are not, we don't normally confuse one for the other. So when I look at my computer, I know this is my computer. But I never ever say this is me. I don't shift between saying computer is me and a computer is mine. But with regard to the body and mind, we will see, if we are careful, if we are alert, if we are vigilant, we'll see that just as a matter of habit, I guess, from the time we were born, and by seeing the way the language is used by other people around us, we sometimes refer to the body and mind or what's happening there as me, sometimes as mine. Some we say, I'm happy, I'm miserable, but those are essentially the characteristics of the mind. Sometimes people say, I am depressed, or say, my mind is feeling depressed. So this I and mine kind of goes back and forth between us, and that is really the confusion that we have. That can the subject ever become an object? And can the object ever become a subject? If the body is the object of my perception, can it ever be me if it is an object? So this is the kind of a discussion that we find in these books. And I said earlier that whatever is separate from me can be taken away from me. So whatever can be objectified is not me. And so the whole quest here is to find the subject and separate the object from the subject. And that's why the title, Vivekachudamani, as you have the text that most of you are looking at, is titled Looking Deeply. Because looking superficially, things might appear in one way. But if we look at something deeply, then we begin to notice things that we may not have noticed before. Verse 302. Brahmananda nitir mahabalavata ahankara ghorahina samveshtyatmani rakshate gunamayai chandai tribhir mastakaihi vijnanakhya mahasina dyutimata vichidya shirshatrayam nirmulya himimam nidhim sukhakaram dhiro nubhoktum kshamaha. The bliss of Brahman treasure is covered and guided by an extremely powerful and dreadful egoism snake with 3 fearsome guna hoods. The wise person is able to claim this blissful treasure after severing the 3 hoods and totally decimating the snake with a big and sharpened knowledge sword. So, a very clear imagery. So, Brahman, by true nature, is the treasure. And that treasure is being, and we have this imagery in many stories and in mythology certainly, but also if any of you have been Harry Potter fans, in the very first part you had what's it called, the Sorcerer's Stone, that was being hidden by this very ferocious looking snake. So we find this imagery often, and that imagery is given here. So my true nature, Brahman, is a treasure that is being guarded by this snake, the egoism, which is the primary obstacle to my knowing who I am, with 3 fearsome hoods, guna hoods, sattva, rajas, tamas, the 3 attributes of nature. We have looked at them very often. So the only way we can get this treasure is by killing this snake of the snake. We know even in the Garden of Eden, the snake was the one who started all the problem really. In fact, Mark Twain in one place, he remarked that God did not know human psychology. He said, Adam didn't eat the apple for the apple's sake. Adam ate it because he was told not to eat it. And that's human thing. If you tell someone not to do something, that's the first thing they would want to do. So Mark Twain said, God told him not to eat the apple, and therefore he wanted to eat the apple. If God had told him not to eat the snake, the problem would have been solved right away, if they had just eaten the snake right away. So we find this snake kind of appearing in many different forms in many different traditions. So here the snake is seen here as this ahankara, the ignorance, the egoism that is guarding the treasure. So the idea is this: if I have to reclaim my true nature, then I have to find a way to slay this egoism snake along with these three gunas. And that can be done with the sharpened knowledge sword. That sharpened knowledge sword, really, it is what is referring to the four primary practices we saw in the beginning of this text. Beginning with viveka, discernment, which is how we translate it as looking deeply. So it's discernment, detachment, and then those 6 qualities that were mentioned, restraining, the restraining of the mind, the senses, faith, all of these qualities, and of course, finally, the longing. It's like if we might have all the essential ingredients required. It's like this: you might have all the food, but if you are not hungry, then you wouldn't want to eat it. So we might have all these qualities, but unless I truly feel that bondage, freedom as a goal will not make sense to me. I mean, sometimes people do ask, what is the goal of life? And I often say, it's not for me to say what the goal of life is, because we seek in life what we lack or what we need. No amount of me saying, seek this, is going to help anyone. And so only to a person who feels the weight of ignorance in their heart of, this is what I don't know, I want to know, then knowledge might become my goal. If I truly feel a sense of bondage, then freedom can become my goal. So someone who is incarcerated, someone who is in a prison, a solitary cell, I think that person understands what bondage is. That person is able to appreciate what freedom means. Now, if we already feel, I'm already a free person. If I already feel I'm free, then freedom as a goal would be totally meaningless to me. And therefore, I need to look deeply within myself to see, I feel free, but am I really free? And then we begin to look deeply, then we might discover that I'm not really as free as I thought. Then I begin to discover in how many different ways there is bondage. There is this, I'm kind of handcuffed, so to speak, or cuffed in everywhere, really. Only when we begin to experience that bondage within us, then that longing for freedom will become real in our lives. And so, I mean, people speak about faith, have faith in God, have belief in God. That's a good starting point, but never quite enough. Because ultimately what we want, no matter which tradition we follow, is that God must become real in my life. Once God becomes reality, then actually I don't even need faith. For instance now, if my eyes are closed, then I would have to depend on someone to tell me, presently this room is filled with people. And I need to have faith that that person is telling me the truth, because I'm not able to see you. I need to have faith that all of you are sitting here. But if I open my eyes and see that you are already here, I don't need faith, because I'm already seeing that you are here. You have become real to me, so faith is superfluous. So we need faith in God, unless and until we experience the reality of God. If I experience God, then faith has done its job. So that's why our spiritual journey may begin with faith, in fact, has to begin with faith, but the fulfillment of that journey or the success of that journey will depend when that faith has transmuted itself or transformed itself into a direct experience. Okay, so we will stop here today. If you have any thoughts, ideas, comments, questions, you can come here and say that. Yeah.
Hari Om Swamiji. Swamiji, is the way to eliminate darkness or ignorance through turning on the light of direct experience? We've discussed this before, direct experience.
Mm-hmm.
Can you just clarify if there's any other ways to remove the ignorance through...
No, ignorance can be removed only through knowledge. Just as darkness can go only through light. Yes.
But the goal is not to... is the goal to remove darkness or to bring in light? Or is it the same thing?
Could it be? Yeah. We just I think that's just linguistics. Yeah. I think it's the same. Yeah. I mean, the goal really is neither about darkness or light per se. It's that our present state is a state of suffering. And I'm not just speaking about just the suffering caused by hunger and homelessness and so many other ways. And that's real and that's terrible. But existential suffering. And I'm using the word existential in a very literal sense. Suffering associated with our very existence as human beings. A suffering from which no one is exempt. And I mentioned that before, that just by the virtue of having a body, the suffering associated with aging, sickness, disease, and death, no one is exempt from it. Just by the virtue of having this limited mind, the suffering associated with stress and anxiety and worry, no one is exempt from it. And that's what I call existential suffering. So the goal is really, instinctively, to free ourselves from the suffering. And one way of doing that is, if that suffering has come as a result of ignorance, then the only way it can go away is through knowledge. Yeah. Any other? Yeah.
So how to reduce ahankar? How to reduce ahankar? Because whenever some action comes from outside, it's I which gives reaction to it, right? It's I means my ahankar, my ego gives reaction to it. So it's always I, means if I don't give reaction, then how life will go.
Okay, yeah, good. So, and that's a good question about, everybody speaks about this egoism being the root of all problem and how to get rid of egoism. And it's tough. It's tough partly because sometimes we know that when we have, even doing, it's like, just imagine, now every one of us uses a keyboard for when you use your computer and stuff like that. And we have developed a certain muscle memory. So we don't have to look at the keyboard to do this. Now suppose overnight they decided the position of keys has changed now. Now that's going to be difficult, right? We have gotten used to typing in one way. And now if there's a different keyboard and I'm not used to it, it'll need a lot of practice because the old memory, I will go on typing in a wrong way. If that's true, and we know how difficult it is to change any of our habits, even physical habits. If I'm accustomed to waking up at a certain time, and I say, well, tomorrow onwards I'm going to wake up early, and most of us make that kind of a resolution, and we know how often we fail. Again, just the force of habit. If such is the case, the difficulty, the enormous difficulty in changing even our physical habits, consider the difficulties in changing our ways of thinking. That's so difficult. And now, if we have been so programmed into thinking of this as me, I, this is mine, our relationship with the world and all of this, we can tinker with it a little bit, and that's easy to kind of try to develop a new perspective. But then suddenly to see this I as completely different. I'm no longer a human being, I'm a divine being. I'm not a mortal creature, I'm an immortal being. That's huge. It's like completely changing one's self-identity. And that's difficult because Hindus might say it's a kind of a mental muscle memory we have developed over several lives. And that's the challenge. One way, and that's not the only way, but one way of dealing with that is what Ramakrishna called distinction between the ripe I and the unripe I. And by that he meant is there are kind of how many kinds of egos are there? But not kinds of egos really, but how many ways my self-identity can be expressed. For instance, I am this, I am that, and that's one way of doing it. And what Ramakrishna said was, if my self-identity can be associated with the transcendent, with the divine in some way, then that is still an ego, but that kind of an ego takes me a little bit nearer to my goal. For instance, me saying I'm a child of God. So that's an ego. I am a child of God. But that ego I'm associating with a being that transcends this world. Or philosophically, I can say, I'm not the body, I'm not the mind, I'm the divine spirit. So either way, that kind of an ego will help free me from the ego that is so clinging to my body, mind, and these kind of a very gross material entities. So it kind of loosens the hold. Just this association with something transcendent, association with something divine, makes the hold of the ego a little bit easy to shake off. And so the more that kind of a ripe I becomes my dominant way of identifying myself, I'm going closer to the ideal, and then it becomes easier then to get rid of the ego. But it's tough. It needs a lifetime of practice. It needs tremendous amount of determination, needs willpower, and first of all needs that longing. First of all needs a rationale for wanting to do it. Because simply you tell someone, minimize your ego, get rid of the ego, and the person will say, why? I mean, you see that. It's only when we look at the mischief this ego plays in our lives, only when we see how much it is at the root of all of our pain and suffering and stress and worry and anxiety, and we are convinced that that's the problem, only then we will go around trying to find ways of getting rid of it. Okay. Yeah.
So Swamiji, are you born with ego, or is it ego like samskara, you come with it? Because if you're a purified mind, then you shouldn't have an ego.
Say that again?
I said if you have a purified mind, then you shouldn't have an ego.
Yes, if the mind is completely transparent, of course. If the mind is transparent, it's almost like sometimes the example they give is, if it's a completely clean and polished mirror, you will see a clear reflection of yourself. But if the mirror is covered or distorted or anything, then you won't see. So if the mind is completely transparent, then my true nature will reflect in it automatically. And then the ego will automatically go.
And so then you go into the next life, then you don't...
There is no next life.
There is no next life.
If you want to be born again, then don't get afraid of the ego. Yeah. I mean, that sometimes is terrifying because freedom also means freedom from the cycle of birth and death. So when people are told that you'll be immortal, that kind of sounds nice. But when you're told like, you'll never be born again, it's like, oh, I'm not born again. Where will I be? What will happen to me? I'll just end with a small anecdote. That there is this one person who, and maybe just a story, I don't know whether it really happened, but I read it long back. That one person went to France several years ago and spent a week there, and he was a good writer. He wrote travelogues and wrote a fascinating book about his 7 days there, and with illustration, with photos, and the publisher published it. And it flopped. Nobody bought that book. I mean, they didn't get the kind of sales they were expecting. Then the publisher had a brilliant idea. He said, no need to change the contents of the book. They just changed the title. From 7 days in Paris, they changed the title to 7 nights in Paris. And suddenly lots and lots of copies were sold. Now, clearly, if someone has spent 7 days there, well, they have also been there 7 nights. So, but how we express certain thing makes a difference in how we react to it. And so, if we are told, you will never die again, that sounds great. But you'll never be born again, that doesn't sound that great. But really, if there is birth, there is death. The two go together. If there is coming, then there is going. And so one of the ways the Buddha is described, is called Tathagata. Tathagata really, one of the ways of describing is no coming, no going. So if there is birth, there will be death. If I don't want to die, then I don't have to be born. That's the polarized world. I mean, it's not just that we speak about the country being polarized politically, but really the entire creation is polarized. We speak about, there is light, there is darkness, there is love, there is hatred. Everything is polarized. The only way to get out of this polarized creation is to go beyond these pairs of opposites. So we will stop here today at 302. When we meet next week, we'll begin with verse 303. Om Jananim Saradam Devim Ramakrishnam Jagadgurum Padapadme Tayo Shritva Pranamami Muhurmuhu. On Sunday at 11, we'll have the Easter service, and our subject will be the message of Easter. That will be at 11 o'clock. On next Wednesday, we will continue with this study, and on Saturday, we'll have meditation at 6 o'clock in the evening. So we'll conclude with a prayer now. May the Divine Being, who is the Father in heaven of the Christians, Holy One of the Jewish faith, Allah of the Muslims, Buddha of the Buddhists, Tao of the Taoists, Ahura Mazda of the Zoroastrians, the Great Spirit of the Native Americans, and Brahman of the Hindus, lead us from the unreal to the real, from darkness to light, from death to immortality. May we be granted strength, freedom, and clear understanding. May we learn to see God in our own hearts and in everyone around us. May God bless us all and fill our hearts with gratitude, grace, and love. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.